Welcome to the Essential 99 Punctuation Rules for Court Reporters, video number 11, the comma, part 4. I'm Ken Wick. Let's get started. This video is going to cover ebook rules 10 through 13, which are direct address, interrupting words, phrases, and clauses, introductory or an introductory clause or phrase before the second clause, and contrasting phrases. So rule number 10 is use a comma for a beginning or end of sentence, or commas mid-sentence, to separate names or titles used as direct address. So examples of these are the direct address is in blue, Angela, so here's a name used as address. Angela, comma, did you meet your boyfriend for lunch? The other example is ladies and gentlemen of the jury. This is a form of address. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, comma, we will now break for lunch. I mean, you can almost drop these direct addresses. Well, I guess in this case you are directing it to somebody. So, but effectively you could drop the direct address and have a sensible sentence. So here the direct address is just addressing who it's directed towards, hence direct address. With all due respect, counsel, I object. Once again, you can just drop it. With all due respect, I object. I called in sick that day, sir. So here you put a comma before sir. If sir appeared at the beginning of the sentence, it would be sir, comma, I called in sick that day. And actually, you can actually move these direct forms of address anywhere in the sentence. With all due respect, I object, comma, counsel, or counsel, comma, with all due respect, I object. And you can do this, did you meet your boyfriend for lunch, comma, Angela, question mark. We will now break for lunch, comma, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Or we could say, we will, comma, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, now break for lunch. So that can slide. That's an indication of if it's a direct form of address. Interrupting words or an interrupting word, phrase, or clause. Rule number 11. Use commas to separate a word, phrase, or clause that interrupts the flow of the sentence. An interrupting element usually comes between the subject and the verb. Not always, but that's a typical location. The injured victim, comma, because of loss of blood, comma, collapsed. See, you could say, maybe this should be the injured victim collapsed because of loss of blood. Here you've taken that that phrase and stuck it and just moved it elsewhere in the sentence, and it interrupts the natural flow of that subject, verb, object. Mr. Smith, after the meeting, called with the information I requested. Once again, you could actually take this interrupting element and move it somewhere else in the sentence if you really wanted to. And notice how it also becomes between the subject and the verb. So you could say, after the meeting, Mr. Smith called, or you could say, Mrs. Smith called blank, blank, blank after the meeting. So here, though, it's been moved. This element of the sentence has actually been moved to interrupt the natural flow. By natural flow, I mean subject, verb, object. And then these type of interruptions are maybe more common. You'd say, I, worry all the time. And another common one that are interrupting is the word like. I worry all the time. So if you have this, you'd say I, comma, you know, comma, worry all the time, or I, comma, like, comma, worry all the time. So I would say when the questions comes up with how do you punctuate you know and like, well, that's how you do it. You separate it with commas. I think this is the last example. Mrs. Anderson is being sued, so I've been told, by her previous attorney. Because you could actually move this somewhere else in the sentence. So an introductory clause or phrase before the second independent clause. So rule number 12 is if you have an introductory clause or phrase, or if an introductory clause or phrase precedes the second independent clause in a compound sentence. So just to clarify, this is in a compound clause. You have a first independent clause and a second independent clause. What happens if a introductory phrase comes before that second independent clause? Well, the answer is if you have that case, then you use a semicolon before the coordinating conjunction. It says or comma, and we'll cover when to use what. Before, so you use a semicolon before the coordinating conjunction and a comma after the introductory clause or phrase. And then I say omit, or the rule says omit the comma for one-word conjunctive adverbs. So what is all that? So let's cover this a little bit more in detail. I think the examples really help make this rule clear in your mind. So, like I said, comma, semicolon, or comma. Well, the default is the semicolon, and that's rule 20 when we get there. But a comma may be used if no misreading is likely. And this is subjective. And maybe I'll state when I use it, but that's just my opinion. But basically, if you look up the rules, they basically say it is the semicolon and the commas can be used if there's no misreading. So basically the semicolon is never wrong. But in some cases the semicolon looks a little too strong. I hate to use that word, but the comma looks better. So what is this rule really for? Well, this rule really eliminates excessive commas, especially the comma after the conjunction, meaning if you were to actually punctuate this without knowing this rule, you would actually have an independent clause, a comma, a conjunction, a comma, a phrase, a comma, and another independent clause. And maybe the examples spell that out, and I'll point that out. So just to state where we find this rule is not found in the BGGP. And the LMEG only covers this rule for the parenthetical expression case. Which is interesting to note is when I use the comma, I tend to only use it for the parenthetical case. So very interesting that the LMEG only has it for this case. But this rule is covered in the GRM and the Chicago Manual style. So let's get down into it. So subordinate clause. So if you're wondering, you've been reading that rule, not too sure what I've been talking about, well, here it is. So once again, we have a independent clause right here. Then we have another independent clause right here. We have a coordinating conjunction. But then we stick in this this phrase or clause. The question is, how do you punctuate this? And this is what I was talking about before. Is normally, if you were to take all the rules that you've been taught so far, is that you would say, we can meet Wednesday afternoon, comma, or, and then by rule, you'd stick another comma right after this or. Or if you prefer, we can meet Thursday morning. So what this rule is really saying is that having this comma, coordinating conjunction, comma just is too much. It just is. It's an excessive. It's excessive use of the comma. So what they're really saying is you can delete this comma here. And here notice that I used the I did use the comma. Whoops. I did use the comma between the two. I'm sorry. The rule actually says semicolon. In this case, I used it because I didn't think a misreading is likely. Maybe just to say why I used it, here's how I generally use it, is that if I tend to use it for the parenthetical, but I've always noticed that I use it when this phrase is short. And typically it doesn't contain a verb. And the reason, this is just me, this is not a rule, but I think if you start adding verbs, it starts looking like someone may start confusing it for the verb of the sentence. So this is just me. My thing is that usually this phrase is short and contains no verb. That's just me. So, but the rule is that no misreading. So here's an example. Here we'll move on to our next example. So here you have a independent clause, or I arrive late to work. Once again, you have this coordinating conjunction and then an interrupting or an introductory clause or phrase to the second independent clause. So here we put the semicolon, and then like I said before, normally you put a comma here, but the rule is basically saying you can get rid of this comma, or you get rid of this comma so it's not excessive punctuation. So I arrived late to work, semicolon, and when no one was watching, comma, I slipped into my office. Once again, my personal preferences, I didn't, this is just me. Once again, it's a little long. And by long, I sort of notice my cutoff is somewhere around 4 words and no verb. So me, I used the semicolon. Once again, the semicolon is never wrong. So verbal or prepositional phrase. So as you can see this pattern over and over again. It's just a you can read the example for yourself, but it's an independent clause, and then you have this coordinating conjunction. You have this introductory phrase or clause, and then you have this independent clause. And once again, semicolon, no comma here, and put a comma here. So we can meet Wednesday afternoon, semicolon, or in the event you're busy, comma, we can meet Thursday morning. And just another example, I arrived late to work, semicolon, and realizing that no one noticed, comma, I slipped into my office. I know, these are just basically repeats of this one, but I'm just using, in this case, different types of phrases and clauses. And then the transitional parenthetical. Here's a case where I use the comma. We can meet Wednesday afternoon, comma, or all things considered, comma, we can meet Thursday morning. Once again, the LMEG basically has a rule of if this is a parenthetical expression, then you use a comma here, or you delete, or basically, you're deleting the comma after the coordinating conjunction. Once again, if you had a semicolon here, that's why I made this red. It would also be correct. What's really incorrect in all these cases is having the comma after a coordinating conjunction. In fact, in most cases, when you're actually punctuating, having a comma after a coordinating conjunction is not likely. I'm not going to say never happens, but it's not likely. Usually there's rules to stop any form of comma, coordinating conjunction, comma. So next example, I arrived late to work, comma, and to tell you the truth, comma, no one noticed. So maybe it's a violation of, remember I said 4 words in a verb, and yet I've violated my own tip. So once again, it's just a tip, not an absolute rule. The rule is put a semicolon here, no comma here, put a comma here. And changing this to a comma is okay if there's no misreading. And I think in this case there's no misreading. And the one word exception, remember if this transitional or conjunctive adverb is one word, then there's no comma after the conjunctive adverb. So in this case would be, we can meet Wednesday afternoon, or otherwise we can meet Thursday morning. Another example is, I arrived late to work and unfortunately everyone noticed. Contrasting phrases. Rule number 13. Use a comma or commas to separate a contrasting phrase. Common contrasting phrases start with not. Very common to start with not. So the contrasting phrases normally start with not, rather, rather than. I think it's supposed to be a comma here. Sorry, never, but, though, or even though. And there's others, but I'd say not is the most common. Plead for mercy, comma, not justice. So this is a contrasting phrase to this. So you separate it with a comma. The meeting occurred on Mondays, comma, never Tuesdays. This is contrasting phrase to this, so therefore it's separated with a comma. They meet on Mondays, comma, rather than Tuesday. Oh, they met on Monday, comma, rather than Tuesday, as the report indicates. So this rather than Tuesday is a contrasting phrase, therefore it is separated with commas. That's it for this video. Please subscribe. If you like the video, please hit like, and please buy the ebook. Thank you.